I said last week we would look at this week. We're still looking at some background material, hopefully that is of interest to individuals. Hopefully it's something that you gain things from. It's history in many ways, but it is interesting to say the least. And tonight we're looking at what we call the sects, S-E-C-T-S, of the Jewish religion. In between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, there was about a 400-year period in which God didn't reveal himself. God chose to be silent. Now, why? Who knows? But basically, you could say, well, it's the providence of God, and he was getting everything in line, and I would agree with all of that. But from the standpoint of saying, well, this is exactly where it says it in Scripture, you don't see that. This period is called intertestamental period or intra-biblical period. It is that time, like we say, when you look at from a standpoint of chronology, time, date. Some of the last of the minor prophets wrote in the 400s BC. And of course, then when Christ came, then of course we have what we call AD. But in that 400-year period, one of the things that happened is that you had these sects, Pharisees, Sadducees. If you think about it, let me back up for just a second. If you think about it, there's a few things in the New Testament that are not found in the Old Testament, right? Can you think of them? Besides the sects, can you think of anything else? Lord's Supper. Very true. What else? Baptism. The laver, of course, in the temple was used, and it was used for washing, and it was what's called, in theological circles, it's called type antitype. That's the type, and the antitype is baptism. In other words, the opposite or what's akin to it. And but yeah, baptism, Lord's Supper, first day of the week, but still they worshipped. Worship type, where you went to worship. Things like that. Well, but the obvious things, like say, Lord's Supper, baptism, be the first two that would come to mind. There are other things that arose. There are customs that arose. There are habits that arose. There are people that changed. And so what you have then in the Old Testament, for the most part, is you had children of Israel. And it was children of Israel and everybody else. And so you were a Jew or you were everybody else. Well, then in the year 332, and I want to give you a little historical background. I want you to capture something. In the year 332 to 167 BC, the Greeks were in charge. The Greeks had come in. They had taken over the land of Canaan, the Palestine, the Jewish area, whatever you want to call it. And they really impacted. They made a tremendous impact upon the Jews and the Jewish way of thinking. And so then, after them, the Romans came. The Romans came about 165 BC and on throughout then the New Testament. In 167 BC, or excuse me, 175 BC, this was during the time of the Greeks. There was a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. Matter of fact, Antiochus the fourth of Epiphanes is really, if you get down to the specific individual it was. He despised, he hated Jews, and he hated Judaism. And he did everything within his power to eradicate the Jews and Judaism. He destroyed a lot of Bibles during that period of time, or scriptural writings. He killed a lot of Jews. He desecrated the temple. Matter of fact, he carried a pig into the temple and had it sacrificed in the temple to desecrate the temple. He did some damage to the temple. It had to be, if you will, fixed again after Antiochus IV. He even went in and had a monument, for lack of a better term, of Zeus built and established in the temple area, so as once again to desecrate the temple. He did not like Judaism. He did not like the things that they taught. He was, in many ways, he was a narcissist by all means, but you might even say atheistic in his approach. Well, this led to a revolt, and you'll see in as we get into this lesson, but just remember this. This led to a revolt, and this revolt occurred about 167 BC. There's a man by the name of Maccabeus, or Maccabees, we often call him, and his 5 sons, who led a revolt against Antiochus and Greece and all the things that went on there. And in a year and a half, 2 years, by December the 25th of 165, they were able to rededicate the temple. And so they were able to kind of run the Jews out, run the Greeks out, and they were beginning to overcome and to take. As a matter of fact, in 167 to 63 BC, you really have a period of time in which the Jews were pretty much independent. Now, in 63 AD, BC, in 63 BC, the Romans will come in, and like I say, then they'll go to the 400s after, well, almost 500 years all told for them to rule over, to have the land of Palestine. But it was during this period of time, during 167 to 63 BC, where the Jews had their independence, that people such as the Hellenists, you might remember the term Hellenist. We looked at it when we looked at it at Acts 6 here a few weeks ago on Sunday morning, who were a group of individuals that simply were very sympathetic to the Greeks. They trusted the Greeks. They went along with the Greeks. And then you have the Hasidims and the Maccabeans that arose and created groups. And it is in that time frame, 167 to 63 BC, that most of the groups that we're going to talk about the rest of the evening arose. Now, having understood that history, I want you to also note something, because a little later on we're just going to kind of pass it by. But if I tell you about it now, then I think you'll understand it. And you probably know this. But in the Old Testament, and even through that period of the intertestamental period, there was, with regards to the Jewish teachings and Jewish beliefs, Torah. The Torah is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch. That was the teaching. But then when you get into it, as the years passed after the close of Moses leading the children of Israel, and once especially the children of Israel began to get settled into a land, a lot of what we will call oral traditions began. These were things that just sort of came about through the practices that they were doing. In other words, we have certain traditions here, right? Certain number of songs that we sing on Sunday morning, certain number of songs we sing on Sunday night, certain number of songs we sing on Wednesday night, devotional before we go to class, time of services tradition. And it's sort of the things that are unwritten, Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. Those things are sort of unwritten, and we expect to meet and think that they are what is right. Some people, some churches don't have Sunday night service. As a matter of fact, I was looking at one. Somebody told me to look at something the other day, and I looked at their website, and they actually have, instead of a 6 o'clock Sunday evening service, they have a 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon service for whatever reason. I know of another church that is, I don't know if it's technically in Cheatham County or if it's in Dixon County. I think it's actually in Cheatham County. That right now they're a very small congregation, about 10 people, and the preacher from another congregation goes over there and preaches a service at 12 o'clock. And so they basically have one service from 12 to, I guess, 1, and then they go home. That's all they have right now. Well, there would be some, not saying you all, but there would be some that say, oh, that's heresy. Why? Well, because we're supposed to have Sunday night, we're supposed to have Wednesday night, we're supposed to have Bible school. Where do you find that? Where do you find that in the Bible? Now, when the of course, first day of the week, yes, but times and Wednesday night, those are things set up by elders. And Hebrews 13, we're to obey those that have the rule over you. So we are to do those things, to meet those things that the elders have set forth. But that is to say, then we develop our own oral law. Well, in the Old Testament time, the children of Israel, the Jews, developed their oral law. And it became, if you will, it became part of the law that they held to. Some said, well, we're only going to hold to what Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy holds to. Others said, we're going to hold to that plus the oral law. In other words, whatever oral tradition has been passed down as being law, we're going to make it law. And so that was then called the Mishnah. The Talmud of the Talmud, which is really several books, but the Talmud was basically about 200 BC, during that intertestamental period, was the written down, or what they did is they wrote down the oral laws, and that was the Mishnah then. The Talmud was, and still is, several books that the Jews hold, one being the Pentateuch, one being then the Mishnah, and one then being a commentary, the Galbia, which is a commentary over the Mishnah. Can you imagine? We think this is a lot. And you think, well, you know, the Jews had it easy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. First of all, that's very complicated. But second of all, then they had the Mishnah, the oral law, and then they had the Galbia, which was the commentary over all of that. And they had to know all of it. But the writings, the first of all, the gathering of the Talmud, the writing of the Mishnah and all, didn't come until this intertestamental period. Well, because of this, and because of this difference of opinion, these Jewish groups arose for religious reasons, and some, it will say, arose for political reasons. And so let's look at a couple of these. Let's look at a few of these. Let's see if we can get a sense of who they are and learn from them, and learn not only from them, but we'll show you these in text, and maybe that will help you understand the text as you study them in your own private study. First of all, let's talk about the Pharisees. The Pharisees were first mentioned by name somewhere in the period of time between 135 and 105 BC. And what they were was they were reactionaries to the Greek culture. They opposed the Greek culture. They didn't think that was what God wanted them to be. Remember, these are Jews now. These are folks that live in the land of Palestine. These are folks that have cut their teeth, if you will, on the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And so they're upset about how that Greek culture has influenced the customs of the day, and how that folks they've begun, if you think about it, they've begun to accept the Greek language. Matter of fact, it was during this time frame, the intertestamental period, that you have the Septuagint. You know what the Septuagint is? The Septuagint, or if you read religious books, you'll just simply see capital L, capital X, which is the symbol for Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now, you got to remember, the Old Testament, for the most part, was written in Hebrew. There are about 9 chapters of the Old Testament, and part of it is part here and part there. But about 9 chapters altogether in the Old Testament that were written in Aramaic. Everything else was written in Hebrew. In the New Testament, of course, that's after this time frame that we're really talking about. It was written, the writers wrote in Greek. And so the Septuagint, which came about during this intertestamental period, was the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Well, the Pharisees didn't like this. This wasn't what they thought it should be. They didn't think this was proper. And so they began to rise up. They were ultra-legalists who placed great emphasis on tithing and ceremonial purity. Look in Matthew 23. You know the story quite well, I'm sure. But we'll go over it again and just show you something where Jesus really lays into the Pharisees. In Matthew 23, Jesus is speaking, and he gives, of course, a long discourse here. It's one of the sermons that Matthew records for us. And in verse, I want to go all the way back. I want to go back to verse 16. Woe to you blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold, And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he's obliged to perform it. In other words, what had happened is the Pharisees had made, as part of their oral law, they had made the sense of, if we swear by one thing, we don't have to do it, but if we swear by something else, we have to do it. In other words, that swearing had to be banked on, relied upon, built upon certain things. Now, that's what's according to their oral law. And God, or rather Jesus, is saying, no, you take an oath, you take an oath. Look what he says in verse 20. Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it, and by all things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it, and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God, and by him who sits on it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. They were legalists. Now, when you think of a legalist, what do you think of? When I say a legalist, what do you think about? What comes to mind? A lawyer, yeah. A judge, yeah. It's somebody that is exacting on the law. There's no mercy, there's no grace. It is, in other words, 55 miles an hour posted. That's the speed limit. But sir, I was only going 56 miles an hour. What's the speed limit? 55. But I was only going 56. It doesn't matter. Here's your ticket. That's a legalist. 55, no more. So, yeah. So, and a couple other towns I know of. But here's the point. The Pharisees in Matthew 23 were saying, notice what he said. You talk about give a tithe or a tenth of your anise or your mint or cumin. These are small herbs that we might find in a garden. And they would go as far from a legalistic standpoint to say, even those little bitty herbs that you find in your garden, you have to give a tenth of them to the Lord, because it was commanded under the old law to give a tenth of what you received. So Jesus says, look how legalistic you are. You're talking about giving a tenth of just a little herb to God, but there are things that are more important, and you have neglected them. Legalists have a difficult time being what? Consistent. And so, while the Pharisees were legalistic in their approach, Jesus let them know that there has to be certain, if you will, leeway, certain amount of following all of the law and not just part of it. And yet they followed the oral traditions of their fathers, and we've already talked about the oral law. Galatians 1 verse 14 is probably a good example for these folks. Galatians 1 verse 14. Paul is talking about himself. He said, I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers, which was really the oral law, the oral teachings, but the oral traditions, the things that they had just accepted, that God not necessarily had made law, but they had through their interpretation of the law. And so these Pharisees, they accepted and followed the oral traditions. They accepted the unseen spiritual worlds, angels, spirits, bodily resurrection of the righteous. They believed in the eternal torment for the wicked, but they did not feel, and this is interesting, they did not feel that evil men would be resurrected from the grave. They just didn't get anything, according to the Pharisee. They believed in man's free will, yet they ascribed everything, if you will, to either fate or to the providence of God. Now, there are some things we do that don't fit into any of that. You go get a drink of water, say, tonight after church when you go home. You might say, well, that's to nourish my body. That's to quench my thirst. That's because I needed a little bit more to wet my palate or whatever. It has nothing to do with the providence of God. Well, the Pharisee would either say it's part of the providence of God and God working his providence out through individuals, or it's simply fate. I think you see the kind of the misdirection of that, but nevertheless, that was their belief. And some of them, of course, were show-offs and extremely self-righteous and hypocritical. You remember in Matthew chapter 6, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about those that were fasting, and he also talks about those that were giving of their alms, and he also talks about those that were praying. He talks about them from a hypocritical standpoint. They were giving their money, but they were giving it to be seen of men. There were those that were praying, but they were standing out, and many times when they were praying, they were standing out in the street corner, some of them throwing their hands up, their chest out, their head back, hollering out their prayers, so as Jesus says, to be seen of God. Some, as they gave their money, were doing it in such a way as to put on a show on. Remember, we talked about in the temple, when you came into the treasury, there were 13 inverted trumpets, and you could go lay your money in any of those in that little area there of the temple. We talked about that last week. They would make a show of it. They'd hold their money up. They might holler. They might have paid some people to talk about, hey, look at Joe. Look at what he's doing. And they did it for show. There also were those that were fasting. Now, I'm thankful that the Lord didn't command that we have to fast. We can fast if we want to for a particular reason, for a particular period of time, but we don't have to from a standpoint of the law. There were fasting times in the Old Testament. But there were those, especially the Pharisees bent, that fasted, and when they fasted, they would put on makeup to make them look gaunt. They would put powder in their hair to make them look bad. And they may not really have even fasted, but they would proclaim to fast. Well, a lot of those people were of the Pharisee bent, and Jesus talks about them in Matthew 6 and how hypocritical they are. And then they were self-righteous and they were hypocritical. Anything about the Pharisees? Well, then part of the Pharisees were the scribes, and we've talked about them in the Bible. But they belonged to the Pharisee party. The scribes were the lawyers, the teachers of the day. They knew the law, they studied the law, they understood the law, both civilly and religiously. So in other words, they were often found in the gates of the city. Why were they found in the gates of the city? Where the business was transacted and also where the courts were. Very true. And so they were found there in the gates oftentimes. They were also, some of the scribes were folks that, for lack of a better term, I have used this before. I don't know that I've used it here, but they were the Xerox copy machines of their day. In other words, you didn't have photocopy machines. You didn't have, Johann Gutenberg didn't come in until the, I want to say 1600s, with the movable printing press. That hadn't happened yet. And so the copies of the scriptures that were made by scribes. And so this was a religious group in many ways, because what they did is they took the law and they applied it to people's lives, sometimes good and sometimes bad. These folks really made up the Sanhedrin Council. Look in Matthew 16. I guess would be probably as good as of any of those that are listed there. Matthew 16, verse 21. Always within the eye of Jesus was Jerusalem and getting back to Jerusalem. And Jesus had gone off. If you remember, Jesus was in the Galilean area. He was in Jerusalem, and persecution had gotten so heavy that he went up into, he was in Judea. He went up into the Galilee. He went up into, you remember the Sea of Galilee. You remember how we talked about that and how that it flowed, the Jordan River flowed into the Dead Sea. You remember that? And we talked about the Sea of Galilee. Well, he went up into that area. But it was always with an eye of coming back to Jerusalem. And Matthew 16, we see Matthew's account of Jesus kind of making that turn and going. It says, for the time Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. Now, here's the catch on this. Admittedly, Matthew is writing this years after it happened. But Matthew is telling everybody, even today, us, how it really was. Jesus was trying to tell his beloved apostles and those that were around him closely, I got to go back to Jerusalem, and I got to suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the scribes. And then he talks about, of course, being killed and being raised. Ultimately, he was saying the Sanhedrin Council is going to get me. These were scribes. Then you had the Sadducees. Anything about the Pharisees or the scribes? The Sadducees. Their name, we don't know exactly where it came from. It could come from two sources. It could come from, first of all, from a corruption of the name Zadok, who was, if you recall in the Old Testament, you recall that he was a priest. And they claimed to be of his lineage. It could have been from that, or it could have been from a corruption of the Hebrew word Zadokim. And Zadokim simply means righteous. And so we're not sure. History doesn't tell us. Historians, we haven't gotten enough information yet to really decide definitively which one it is. But these folks their big boast was their faithfulness to the law. Now think about it. The Pharisees boast in, we do the law. But the Sadducees boast in the fact that they were truly faithful. We're the most faithful. So you see, here's a difference. There's a difference of opinion with regards to these folks. The Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Pharisees may have been the largest group. Some say that in Jerusalem alone there were 6,000 Pharisees during the time of Jesus. I think Josephus is the one that gives us that number. We don't know exactly if that's correct, and their census taking in that day and age, how reliable was it anyway? But we do know that there were Pharisees and there were Sadducees, and they didn't get along. They had differences of opinion with regards to religion. Notice some of their traits. They were the aristocracy of the Jews. They were the party of the high priesthood, according to Acts chapter 4, and we studied that recently, so I'm not going to get into that. They were inclined towards deism. Just to refresh your memory, deism is basically an oversimplification of it, at least, is that God created everything. He set everything into motion, and then he stepped back, and he's hands off, even today. And there are deists today. If you read early colonial writings for us, the United States, if you read a lot of the early American literature, and you say it has a religious note about it, many of those guys were deists, though. Deism was sort of the popular thing in that era. And like I say, it's basically the idea God created, God made, but God stepped back and God says, you're at it, it's up to you. The Sadducees were really deists. They were materialists. They denied spirits, angels, the immortality of the soul, the resurrection of the dead. That was contrary to what the Pharisees believed. Now, and we're going to study this when we get in further in the book of Acts on Sunday mornings. But go ahead and look in Acts 23. I want you to see, and why I want you to look at this is I want you to see how the Pharisees and Sadducees were different, and how that Paul used what he knew, which is interesting, but he used the beliefs of both the Pharisees and Sadducees sort of to save himself. Now remember, what was Paul's background? He was a Pharisee. Or in Philippians 3, he said he was a Pharisee. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. And so he knew the Pharisee position, but evidently he knew the Sadducee position as well. So in Acts 23, beginning in I want to begin, I know it says 6, but if you don't mind, let's go to verse 2 at least. It says, the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Excuse me. Whale would fit too. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command to be struck contrary to the law? Those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees, now follow this, this is where we really want to start. One part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried to the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I'm being judged. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. In other words, what he said, all of a sudden the Sadducees that were there heard, and the Pharisees, when he talked about, notice what Paul said. He said, I'm being judged on the hope and the resurrection of the dead. And the Pharisees probably said, amen. And the Sadducees said, what do you mean? There's no such thing. And there began to be an argument. For the Sadducees say, verses 8, this is verse 8, say there's no resurrection, no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confessed both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisee party arose and protested. Now, Notice what it said, scribes of the Pharisees. Who are they? The judges, right? They arose. We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. Now, remember, they're Pharisees. They believe in spirits. But the Sadducees, they're there, they don't. Now, when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him to the barracks. Paul saved his life by pitting the two sides against each other. Why? Because they were diametrically opposed to each other, and they didn't get along. When is a time in which they did get along? Yeah. They right before in Matthew 23, they are putting Jesus to the test, and they ask questions and they gang up on him that time, and then ultimately when they crucified him, that's when they got together in cahoots. Well, the Sadducees regarded only the Pentateuch. They only, in other words, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's all you went by. You didn't go by that oral law. You didn't go by that oral tradition. You didn't go by the Mishnah. You didn't listen to the Mishnah at all. You listened only to what was found in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they were instrumental, of course, in Matthew 27, to the death of Christ. I want you to see some others right quickly. I want you to see the Zealots. I want you to know a tad bit about the Zealots. The Zealots were revolutionaries that didn't like Rome. They revolted against Rome. They revolted against the taxation of Rome. Zealots in biblical times. And do you recall a zealot in the Bible? Simon, who was an apostle, was a revolutionary. Zealots, you remember they wore the long robes? Zealots often had a small knife attached to the inner thigh, either left or right thigh, and they often pulled it out, and in the midst of crowds, they'd just go by and their enemies, and they'd kill them, and they'd keep going. Nobody'd ever know who did it. It does. That's why I wanted to bring it up. I think of the same thing, yeah. And so they led, of course, to an uprising, and in many ways, you could say, well, we needed them. They're part of God's providence, because ultimately they led to the revolt that caused Rome to come in and break up, if you will, break up Jerusalem, destroy Jerusalem. And so that's really when Christianity spread. It had already spread, because AD 70, Paul's already done all of his work. The diaspora that we just talked about on Sunday mornings has happened. Paul's work is finished. And so, but right after that, the gospel really spread. And so in many ways, you could thank the Zealots for their part in it. You had the Herodians. They were a small group. They were mainly Sadducees. They supported a Herodian dynasty. In other words, they thought that everybody ought to go back and do what the Herods said, and that they ought to establish the Herods and the Herodian dynasty. The Essenes we don't find in the New Testament. However, if you do really read religious books, you may come across the Essenes. They basically were an ascetic group. In other words, they lived out in the country, away from everybody, what we today call off the grid. And they were a real group, but they really had no influence. This is a group, the last group, though, it's not found in the Bible, but it's interesting, and I want you to see it right quick. The Zadokites, they are not found in the Bible. They're a group that instituted a reform movement to reform and correct the corruption that they saw in the temple and in temple worship. Some of their traits: opposed both Pharisees and Sadducees. They accepted the entire Old Testament, rejected all the oral traditions. But they accepted all the Old Testament, which means they even accepted the prophets. They accepted the books of wisdom. They accepted books of history, wisdom, poetry, and then the prophets. They believed in the spiritual world. They stressed self-denial, strict adherence to the Levitical code, and a need for repentance. Now, here's what I wanted you to see, and this is why I just brought this group up. They were constantly looking for a teacher of righteousness who they said would call Israel back to the divine ideal and usher in a messianic age. Now, you don't find them in the New Testament, but this group is believed because of, look at what number 5 says, because of what they were looking for, that they assimilated very quickly into Christianity and the Christian movement. In other words, they followed into the Christian movement very easily because that's what they were looking for. But that's the major groups that you had in that time frame during that time, and especially the ones that are mentioned in the Bible. And I gave you even a couple that are not mentioned in the Bible. Anything anybody'd like to say? It is interesting when you stop and think about it. It always has been interesting to me, at least, that you have this zealot that was part of the apostles, that was a revolutionary, and yet Jesus took him in, made him one of his 12. Probably did. But here's another aspect of that. Jesus brought 12 guys that had various backgrounds. They went with him 3 years, and he trained them enough that they went out and spread the gospel. And if it hadn't been for them, where would we be? We don't know, of course. But the thought is that Jesus took 12 men that were so different. It reminds us that we can be united. We may not always agree. We may not always see everything eye to eye, but we can get together and we can become a nucleus, if you will, of what is needed for the Lord, to be used by the Lord to do the Lord's work. But we have to be willing. And we have to be open to the fact that sometimes, we don't get our way, and sometimes we don't see eye to eye, and we'll talk it out as they did in the early church. Acts 15 is a great example of that. We'll talk it out. We'll figure it out. We'll agree. We may agree to disagree, but we'll agree and we'll move forward. Anything else? I'm sure those women want out. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, thankful for the blessing of it, thankful that you love us, that you watch over us, thankful for the care that you do give us. We're thankful that we do know so much of the history of things in the Bible and around the Bible. And while we don't know everything, and yet as well, we do find that with each discovery, we find out more and more of the things that we have always held and believed to be true are true. And we are thankful for those things. And we ask that you be with us, that as we are your students, that we will ever strive to live with you, for you, and near to you. We ask that you be with those that Jay mentioned in our announcements. Watch over them and bless them. Be with every effort that's put forth in this congregation. Help us to spread your word to the world that's lost. Watch over us, bless us, and keep us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. We got a couple more of these lessons, and then we'll get into the book of Joshua. Thank y'all. Have a great week. Rest of the week.